Hi, and welcome to the Business of Us podcast, where we explore the intersection of business, relationships, and family life. This season, we're focusing on the concept of the three mountains of partnership, purpose, and passion, which are the three big challenges that all couples face throughout their relationship. Whether you're scaling your first mountain or learning to navigate life after the summit, these episodes will give you stories, strategies, and inspiration for the journey. Please keep in mind our podcast is for information only and is not therapy. If you need therapeutic support, we recommend visiting psychologytoday.com. So, the big question that we're exploring today is what does it actually take for entrepreneurial couples to stay connected when life and business feels overwhelming? And today I'm going to be actually interviewing my co host. And so I'm going to introduce him now. So, Cameron Madill founded a multi-million-dollar company that he sold to his team in 2019, which led him to realize his true passion is helping people build strong relationships. He has conducted original research with over 600 entrepreneurs and their spouses to understand how thriving relationships drive both personal well being and sustainable success. You can read his work at www.relationshipscienceguide.com. And today he runs Happy Couples Project, which is focused on experiential date nights and workshops. Thanks for showing up today to get interviewed, Cameron. This is a little different seat for you today.
I know, I love it. It's very comfortable and yet somehow different. So,
Mm.
thanks for having me.
Yeah. So we've been talking this quarter about the how, right? Which is how do we make things work when things get really, really hard? And so when you think about entrepreneurial couples, what does that actually mean? Making it work when things get hard.
I think when we think about these three mountains of how do you make it work when things get hard? What do you really want when you achieve success or your goals? And who are you as you kind of move outside of, family and career being your number one? I think this first mountain is so every couple obviously faces it, but I think when you've got, one partner who's an entrepreneur or both, there's just even more going on. You've got the chaos often of transitioning to parenthood or dealing with aging parents. And you've got a business that sometimes is just almost unfathomably difficult. And I think for me personally, I feel like where this really hit home was, I guess it was early 2021 at this point. And I had just had our kid like 6 months earlier. I had sold my company to my employees at the end of 2019. So I thought I was kind of out of the woods. And we were just going through this stretch where we were all remote as a company. There was just this sense that like there might be a mass revolt. And I think, the level of heart and soul that we pour into our business as entrepreneurs, it's really, I think, almost impossible to overstate how much we can commit to and engage with our businesses. And there was just some stuff going on at work where there were people talking about broken promises and camps that were forming. And I remember being on my couch every morning at like 3:30, 4 a.m., 2 a.m., just so worked up and typing notes in my laptop about how I was going to fix it or make sense of it. Meanwhile, my wife had gone back to work at her company. Our kid was having he had done well at first, and he was having a series of just kind of brutal sleep regressions where he just would wake up in the middle of the night and wouldn't be able to sleep. And it really just squeezed out all the time that Anna and I had for each other because we really just couldn't do it. Like we couldn't manage everything that we had to finish. And there was nothing that was left over for the relationship. And so it was almost like a classic, what got us here won't get us there. Like what we were used to doing wasn't good enough. That was really hard. And then of course you throw in, the high stakes of family and business and trying to, take care of those things.
So you also talk about 2018 as being a low point. And so let's talk about that a little bit. And what did that season teach you about making it work? And how did that sort of flow into what you're talking about as you get into 2021?
Yeah, 2018 was another stretch where the company kind of just broke. The previous year, it seemed like kind of everything had worked, and then it was like the clock turned on 2018, and I remember like the income statement just went all red. I'd never seen it so bad. It's funny because we're really good at culture overall. I would say that's what we're known for. But maybe the flip side of that is people get really high expectations, and so a few people were pretty disgruntled, especially unpleasant Glassdoor review had showed up. And really, that was where I think I no longer really had the capacity to do what was needed for my business. And I just put walls up everywhere and I just kind of trudged every day, like one foot after another. What was interesting was I think, learned the importance of, vulnerability, not as a buzzword, but actually in terms of even being aware of what was going on inside of me. I think I had put on up like so many walls because I just felt kind of like attacked from all sides and I didn't see any hope for the future. And so I think the biggest thing that I learned from that, like looking back, is not just that like vulnerability is a great buzzword, but of course, vulnerability, particularly in a leadership position, can be very dangerous. It can very much get used against you. The quip I always tell people is nobody wants to know that the CEO is waking up in the middle of the night thinking about their layoff strategy. Like, I don't want to work at that company. But of course, at the same time, you want your lead executives to be doing all sorts of like disaster, scenarios, contingency planning. And so I think because of that, we all learn to be very good at masking. How do we show up and put a positive face on things? People say, how are things going? They're going great. And so I think the biggest thing I learned was that it's not just about encouraging vulnerability, telling people that it's okay to be vulnerable. But for me personally, and this is what I love to share with people, is the importance of slow spaces, that often we don't actually know what's going on inside of us. And that whole year, I did not know what was going on inside of me. Trying to create those spaces where we're able to really truly say what's going on. What am I feeling in my body? What are these thoughts that I'm unwilling to say out loud? What are maybe some unmet needs I have that I feel guilty over? And so I've never articulated to anyone. So I just think slow spaces are really underrated and difficult to get in our society today.
100%. And I think, right, it's hard to figure out the how if you can't articulate what is going on internally, right? Or even identify it. And so needing to have that space for identification, right? The awareness, and then moving into that how strategy at that point. And the other thing that you said that I think is really relevant is just this concept that some of the things that serve us really well in one area become liabilities in other areas, right? And the confusion between those two places where it's like I do one thing here and that's not serving a purpose here, and how do you start to negotiate and navigate that, right? Where it's like it's just a thing, but how we use that to our benefit or not is then that sort of leverage point. And so I love that you bring that up too. As you were kind of going through these times, what mistakes did you make that you now coach other people, other couples on avoiding?
The first one that comes up is, I think, like an essential thing in any relationship, but maybe especially difficult when there's an outside venture involved. And so that's being able to provide and then on the other end to receive emotional support for the business. And I think because I often make the analogy that, entrepreneurs are kind of like artists, and it's hard to imagine a happy couple where, they're together and one of them is a painter, but the other one just says like, oh, like she's so great, but man, her paintings really suck, or I have no interest in them. Um, but of course, as entrepreneurs, those outside ventures, they give us some high highs, but some very low lows too. And so, everything, it's all on the table, right? Like sudden key people quitting, huge losses of revenue and, considering bankruptcy or layoffs or what have you. And figuring out how to like disentangle those two things so that whoever's in the supporter role, they might both be entrepreneurs like in my family, but regardless, like saying, if I'm the supporter right now, how do I emotionally support my partner without getting hooked by hearing, oh my God, that might mean that, our kids can't go to college, or are we going to have to, mortgage the house? So I think that figuring out how to both make sure that's given and received. I think the second thing is, I only got to that situation because I got way too high in the previous years. It's not like a Cheech and Chong high. I got too full of myself is what I'm trying to say. And I think figuring out how to stay grounded as entrepreneurs is really important. We often spend all day in these companies where, we have a fancy title. People are going to naturally be deferential. They're probably going to think all of our ideas are good, at least to our face. And often there's some really cool stuff that, there might be a chance to go do a cool, a business trip to a cool location, or an award that feels really good, or whatever it might be. And I think ultimately, that I would say is just as, maybe even more dangerous at pulling ourselves away from our partners and thinking of it as a we rather than a me type situation. And then I think the last thing that ties to what I was talking about with vulnerability and slow spaces was, I think just especially important for entrepreneurs is this idea of emotional granularity. Are we able to actually use precise words to describe what we're feeling? Because our emotions are like that. They're like the compass towards what we really need in our lives. And a lot of us have really limited emotional vocabularies. And so there's a lot of research around how this is, protective against, depression and anxiety. It leads to better relationships with others, better ability to understand what others might be feeling and needed. And so I think just taking that effort to really tune in and say, what am I feeling? Then putting a really precise label on it and then figuring out where do I want to take that, I think is so important because we're often so much in this kind of, quote unquote, logic, results driven, achievement driven world that things like emotions get deprioritized and we can end up somewhere other than where we truly wanted to be.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, right, the good news is that emotional intelligence can be learned, right?
Right.
That's something that's well within everyone's wheelhouse to improve upon. I think the other thing you bring up such a good point too around a lot of times when we're talking about the how and sort of climbing that first mountain, we're talking about the things that are really hard and less airtime, I think, is given to when things are going really well. And so to your point, just to sort of reiterate that there's challenge moments that exist in that space too. And so it's kind of the entirety of it.
And we're maybe more willing to change in those painful moments than those ones where things are going really well. If you asked me in 2017, I probably would have said, no, I'm doing everything. Everything's fine.
Yeah.
I'm doing great.
Nothing to see here. We're good.
Yeah, nothing to see here.
Yeah, so I think it's just a great point that I think just wanted to reiterate. In addition to your own personal experience, right, you've also had the benefit of interviewing and working with hundreds of other couples. And so what are some rituals or habits that you've seen in other couples that they use to stay connected when things are really overwhelming, whether that's positive or negative, right? Overwhelm is overwhelm.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two parts to this, so I'll focus on the connection part, which you talked about, because there's also just kind of this logistics, getting stuff done. But I think on the connection front, we live in this world, I think, of false urgency. There's a lot of real urgency, but, just to give you an example, I was looking for something on YouTube the other day. It's actually about this relationship science concept of like approach and avoid goals. But then like amoebas started showing up, and then there were videos about getting amoebas in your brains from neti pots. And then I'm like researching filters to, so like this is how it goes, right? But while it'd be tragic if I died of an amoeba in my brain, the world is full of things like this that are just trying to hook our attention, and our family and our partner can end up having a difficult time competing. And so we end up with, in aggregate, a world like Nate Klemp, who we had on the podcast, talked about, of just busy love, where there's busyness crowding out all the spaces for each other. So I think at the core, the two most essential things I personally think are, I love this idea of deep listening. It's a concept from the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh, who's, one of my sort of just personal heroes and guides. And it can honestly be done in any format. The way my wife and I do it is we just have one of those sand glass timers that are 10 minutes. We just take an hour. We try to do it most weeks. And each person just gets one 10-minute slot. And then you trade, and then you trade, and you filled up your time. And what's beautiful about that is it just slows everything down. So even if Anna says something that really hooks me, I got another 6 minutes. And then I start, I stay open, right? Or I start maybe hearing the thing that hooked me, but now I hear some more context and maybe I can de-escalate, right? Whereas in a discussion, I might jump in. And then it also just creates space for what I was talking about earlier of often just realizing there's something going on that I'm not aware of. It hasn't been conscious. And so just having this space has allowed me to say, I actually am pretty nervous about this upcoming transition to kindergarten. And this is real recent for us. What is this going to mean? Do we need a second car? I don't really like commuting, etc. So I think that space for deep listening, of course, this could be done on a hike or in many other contexts. And then something I know we're both fans of is, a lot of people have talked about it. I love the Gobbin method version of this, of just a weekly connection meeting and structuring it in a way that really amplifies the good in the relationship without hiding from the challenges. And so the basic structure is usually something like one person shares what's working well, what are we doing well as a team, what are some appreciations for the other person, what are some issues, and having kind of a structure to talk about if there's any issues or fights that came up. And then how can the other person show you love in the week to come? And then flipping it. And I just think having that space to make sure that, because our minds are wired for that, negative. We love the whole, if it bleeds, it leads. We love to get into that stuff. But slowing down and just realizing, scanning our environment, like, what are all these things that are working in our relationship? What are some of the things that my partner has done that I'm really grateful for that I could just skip over if I get to the fight? And then actually ending with, like, what can this person do to make me feel loved this coming week? Not a bunch of grievances, not whatever else, but what is something that would actually make me feel loved, where I'm going to be a little vulnerable sharing that? So I think those are my two starting points on the connection front.
Yeah, well, and it's almost like sandwiched connection, right? You're starting and ending with connection and then having the strategy, tactic, related conversations in the middle.
Yep.
I think is great. Okay. Well, and I would imagine, right? I mean, I think, talking about mountain one, I think one of the things that comes up really regularly for folks is this concept of resentment. Some of the connection strategy first before talking about the logistics piece, I think is one strategy at avoiding resentment. And I think that it's just so common that I don't know that anybody gets through any mountain totally unscathed, right? Uh, like there's going to be moments where resentment crops up on one or both sides. And so, how can people sort of recognize when resentment is starting to take root? What are some of the strategies to address that before it really kind of takes over everything?
I think at the core, it's tied to having these kind of connection rituals of having a space where, there's this theory that in relationships, there's all these tools and there's all this, content. But at the end of the day, there's this shift that goes from when a couple is in attack defend mode or attack withdraw mode to self-disclosure mode or vulnerability. That, like, it's that shift when positive things actually come out of it. So I think having space to, as you talked about, Jamie, kind of that sandwich where we're not going to let the conflict or the negative be everything,
Mm.
but we're also not going to suppress it and pretend like it doesn't exist. And so often, sometimes it can just be like saying, hey, when we had that discussion and we were talking about, whatever it might be, in my life, it's childcare logistics all the time, 24/7. And we were talking about that. It didn't feel good when you said, oh, it's no big deal, because it is a big deal to me. I work on it a lot. And then I've shared it and I can just let go. So I think just having those spaces, I think, as you said, Jamie, like, I think resentment is going to happen. Doesn't make you a bad person. Actually, it can be like a guide towards what you really might be needing. And I think that would be my last point, is going back to the brain amoebas. There's this idea that as living beings, there's only two fundamental systems, right? There's an approach system and there's an avoid system, right? That's why I was looking for these little amoebas. But, it's like, right, they're just kind of going around. They're like, is this food? And if it is, they go eat it. And then if it's a threat, they, as we all know, right, we freak out when something negative happens and we run away or we get ready to fight. And so I think just that basic principle of, if there's resentment, saying, okay, like, that's fine. That's actually normal. I should be feeling resentful because I'm not getting what I want. What is it that I want? Like, at a higher level, not necessarily the dishes cleaned up right now, but is it a clean house? Is it a feeling of partnership on, domestic chores? Is it predictability in the schedule in terms of who does what? It could be so many things. When we focus on what we don't want, we're in essence rejecting our partner. But when we focus on what we do want, we've created space for both them and us to grow and build some kind of everybody wins solution.
Yeah, I love that. Resentment is sort of an indicator to take some of that dedicated space that you were talking about, right? That it's a good opportunity to sort of pause and check in with yourself on the higher or deeper, representation of whatever that thing is. The other thing that I think that you talk about a lot is utilizing effective business tools, and translating those into relationships. And so I'd love to hear more about that, and maybe even one practice that you have found to be surprisingly effective for couples.
And it's funny, Jamie, because I used to hate this. I was like, oh, it's so, like, when people talk about thinking of your relationship, like a business and putting it on, some project management software and all of that. But I also think there's a lot of wisdom there. And, at the end of the day, business has figured a lot about how to get things done. And so while a relationship is more than just getting things done, if we're ineffective at getting things done, it's hard to enjoy the good stuff, because everyone's frustrated that the dishes aren't done, or You just literally don't have any time for each other. I will say, if I were to pick one, I think my single favorite thing is this idea of systems thinking. And it's just this idea of, if we step back from a situation, we just kind of diagram it and say, when this happens, what is the common response? And then so on and so forth, and being able to sort of create like a visual of what happens. I remember that this came up in a group I was a member of. It was the first time I heard it. And it was so frustrating because we had this amazing global organization that was sponsoring a local organization. And I was chairing the board, and the board just hated the global organization. And it was so frustrating because I was like, these are all good people. But finally, one of my contacts at the global organization is, we got people together and we got them, I think, getting along better. But it was this crazy, like, how can such good people not get along? And that was when I first heard this idea of accidental adversaries. And so we literally just mapped it out, where it was like, every time that our local board would do something, that would then elicit this response from the global group, and vice versa. And so we were just caught in this loop, much like a couple, right? Of just accidental adversaries trying so hard, but stepping on each other's toes. And so when we were actually able to like really get clear on what those dynamics were and map them out and call them out, we were able to find all kinds of really easy fixes that just completely eliminated them. And I've been accused of being overly optimistic about this, and this is not, nothing is going to be a panacea. But I just think saying, asking that question of like, what in the system is causing these frustrating outcomes is a really different question than, why is this person not doing what I want? And I think it often leads to much more fruitful outcomes.
Yeah, where you're asking different questions and looking at more alignment than personalized responses or reactions.
Yeah, again, it's a growth goal, right? Now you have the possibility for growth and creative thinking. But when you're just saying, stop doing this, because you're stuck in that pattern, it's pretty likely they're going to have the same reaction.
Yeah, can shift you out of it. Yeah. I think the other thing that I hear pretty commonly from couples going through Mountain One is this kind of concept of self-centeredness, which I think relates to resentment breeding in a lot of cases, right? But just this all-consuming nature that entrepreneurship can take, right? I mean, it's literally ingrained in personality and temperament,
Yep.
right? But I think that it does fuel the self-centeredness. And so how can entrepreneurs shift gears at home so that that doesn't damage their partnership? I mean, I hear that all the time, like, they're not the boss of me."
Yeah, great question. So I think, I think you used the magic word, which is figuring out what is that shift that needs to happen when you come home. I know people who put sticky notes on the wheel of their car, or have an agreement. This is next level. Probably few of us will do this. One woman I know, she would actually meditate for 20 minutes in the car before she went through the front door. I think the most important thing is to really try to zoom way out and say, what kind of person do I want to be when I'm at home? And then think about, what that means, and make really clear commitments around that. So one example, my wife and I both have a hard time saying no to things, but I particularly love to say yes. Exciting opportunities come up. And so I actually built this coming out of those moments in 2021 when I was frustrated and on the couch, and kind of everything was, I was very resentful in my relationship because I felt like I wasn't getting the support I wanted. And I finally just came to this conclusion that I was just cramming way too much in, and everything individually looked legit, but in total, it was way too much. And so that there's this psychology concept of people who say, I don't do something versus I can't do something are much more likely to succeed. So someone who says, I don't eat sugar, it's more of like an identity thing. It's self-chosen versus I can't eat sugar. I'm on a diet, or I'm trying not to do that. So I basically made this commitment that anytime someone asked me to do something, I said, I don't make any new commitments until I've talked to my wife and come to agreement. And everyone seemed to respect that for the most part. So I think just looking at what are those things we can do to elevate the identity of us as a spouse, us in our family life, so that it doesn't have to just be an afterthought. And I think it actually can coexist with the business quite well, because in general, when people are happy and well supported in their relationships, they're more productive, more effective, and more successful in their careers.
Yeah. And what a great weeding out tool as well, right? If people are not responding to that well, that good indicator that might not be the project that you should be investing your time or energy on too, right?
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah. But I love that difference between don't and can't, and putting that sort of alignment with family at the forefront of your mind as you're filtering through decisions. Love that.
And Jamie, I want to go back. You asked a really interesting question about, which I maybe didn't quite answer, and I want to hear your take about self-centeredness, because that's a big one. For me, I think at its core, it is that setting of boundaries. But I think the other thing that's really important is looking at what is our sense of like purpose and meaning in life, and what are our values, and how can we reconnect with those? So I think that's another tool for maybe being a little more honest with ourselves and having something other than the excitement and the challenge and sometimes just the gut-wrenching fear of business, having a more like holistic identity than just that, because we've taken the time to say, this is the kind of person I want to be. 20 years from now, this is who I want to be, and it's what I want to be known for. That may not work if all you want to be known for is having a lot of money, but I think most everyone that I know, there's a lot more depth and breadth to who they are than just their business.
Yeah.
The business just has a way of being kind of a compelling source of time usage. But yeah, what do you think, Jamie? How do you reduce
Yeah.
that self-centeredness in someone?
I think for me, it's not necessarily, I guess, the language around self-centeredness. So it appears to be very self-centered, but I actually think that it's just a really out of balance priority. And being able to shift the conversation a little bit, because most of the time that people say that the entrepreneur is self-centered, what I hear is that they're not getting their needs met.
Yeah.
Right. And so if there's this over focus here, but not over here, then that is always going to look to be self-centered. Right. And sometimes it is, and sometimes it's intentional and sometimes it's not. So I think shifting the dialogue a little bit is necessary, because we have less resentment around what our partner is doing if we feel included and if we feel like our cup is full. All of a sudden, then it gets back into that partnership, and we have more tolerance for, the entrepreneur going out to do their self-centered thing.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, I was trying to figure out what I was like, I do know a lot of self-centered entrepreneurs. I'm sure I've been there. But yeah, it's like, again, if you tell me I'm self-centered, what can I do about that? It's very hard. But if you tell me you want, something that fills your cup, that might be doable. It might even be better for both of us.
Right. And then recognizing, right, that the more that other people's cups are full, the more space that we have then to engage in the entrepreneurial endeavors that drive us, right? And it is part of that identity. You can't just change that about somebody, but you can shift, right, the balancing and how you're kind of looking at that. Mountain one seems to be the one where most people are like, I can't breathe. I'm going under. I'm trying to tread water here and I can't quite do it. So if somebody who's listening right now feels like they're kind of drowning at the base of mountain one, what's the first step that you'd encourage them to take?
I might have heard you say this, Jamie, I believe, but I think the very first thing to do is just take a breath. I think sometimes we forget that as human beings, we are made to do hard things. We are capable of so much. And just taking that pause, a little bit of silence, I think is a really critical first step. I think the second thing is ask yourself what will matter in 10 years. I'm not proud of this, but I think it's part of life. And I also think it's important for all of us to talk openly about it. I had a period where I had a lot of resentment towards my wife, probably year and a half into becoming parents. And yeah, I mean, I can't remember any of that stuff. Honestly, I was trying to remember. I can't remember any of it. And so, I think as always, this idea that we're much wiser when we zoom out from, kind of the very narrow moment. And so when we think about what's going to really matter in 10 years, I think that perspective can help us figure out what is truly essential and what is just noise. And then I think lastly, there are so many great tools out there. We talk about them all the time on this podcast. Figure out what is the least effort, biggest impact thing you can do to move it forward. It's not going to be perfect. I love this phrase from a consultant I used to work with. She said, we didn't get into this mess overnight. We're not going to fix it tomorrow. And just figuring out what's that one thing that we could put in place as a couple that will help us to move forward and keep breathing.
Yeah. So it's breath first, 10,000-foot view, which changes how we're looking at things, and then simplify into that one thing that we can do to move forward.
Yep.
Yeah, I love that. The other thing I'd love to explore today, Cameron, I think you've done some really incredible things recently, right? So up until right now, you've been talking more in the historic perspective. But you recently finished your master's degree from UPenn, and even prior to that, had already interviewed over 100 couples. And in your master's program, conducted research for your thesis. And so I'd love to hear uh, what were some of the most poignant lessons that you learned from both of these endeavors? And tell the audience a little bit about those.
Yeah, so the first project was I interviewed 100 couples where one or both were entrepreneurs, and this was kind of a I was stepping down as CEO from my old company and didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I was really curious about this dynamic between an entrepreneur and their spouse and their business. And like, how does that triad interact? And then I ended up doing this graduate program, and we did a research study that had another, I think, 400 plus, maybe it was 391 entrepreneurs fill out a survey about their relationship and their business. And there were a lot of things I was really curious about, but I think, at the core was always that triad. And it was, the single most interesting question in the interviews was, if the business was a person in your life, who would it be? There's actually a research study that shows that the same parts of entrepreneurs' brains light up when they talk about their businesses as parents when they talk about their kids, which was interesting. But to actually hear the responses, it was almost always a family member. And so it really was like, hey, this business is part of your family. And what is the entrepreneur's relationship to the business? Is it kind of like an obsessive helicopter parent, who's putting like everything they've got and vicariously living through their child? Or, is it a parent who's resentful because they think their kid's, disruptive, terrible? And so you can spin this out, but basically it left me with this clarity that your relationship with your business is going to be one of the single biggest impacts on your relationship at home with your spouse. And the thing that I saw in the research that was really cool, and when what I did the final project at UPenn on, was that entrepreneurs are high passion people. Like, we wouldn't do what we do if we didn't have a lot of passion. But it was really digging into this idea that there's two different kinds of passion. There's a healthy passion, what's called harmonious passion, where we love the thing, it's a part of our identity, it's integrated into our life, and we're really choosing to do it. And then there's this other kind of unhealthy passion, which is called obsessive passion, which is where the thing is really kind of fused, this activity is fused with our identity. We don't feel like we can stop. We don't find that we get pleasure from anything else. And so consequently, we have a hard time drawing any boundaries. And what was so interesting in the research was basically most entrepreneurs, almost all of them had passion, and most of them it was very high. But those who had more of that healthy passion were much happier in their personal lives. They were happier in their relationship, and they actually were more successful in their businesses. So passion was connected to success in both cases, but entrepreneurs who are able to sort of integrate their business into their relationship in their life in a more healthy way benefited on all fronts. I've just seen over the years, especially on Mountain One and the How, it is so hard. There's a lot of 3 a.m.s, I guess, in my stories. I remember being up at 3 a.m. in LA, visiting a friend, building spreadsheets, trying to figure out how to track time properly. And there's a lot of that just really hard kind of gritting it out type work being an entrepreneur. And I think that can lead to this kind of, we exalt this idea of hustle culture of, I have no boundaries. I don't show up to any of my kids' sporting events. And I think just highlighting that ultimately that may lead to, it probably will lead to success in the short term. But when you get over the long haul, it's not going to lead to success in your relationships. It's not going to lead to success in your own mental well-being and mental health. And there's a pretty decent chance that it'll come back to bite you on the business front. But at the end of the day, if you've wrecked your mental health and your relationships, does it really matter that your business has succeeded?
Yeah. It goes back to that, right? Redefining what success means, and that sustainability, right? In terms of your mental health and your relationship are also critical components to that. So I love what you're saying. So you then turned all of this research into a Substack, relationshipscienceguy.com. Tell us about that journey.
Yeah, I mean, the short version of this is I just love relationship science. I think relationships are so important, but it's actually a relatively new field. And so, a lot of what's out there is just kind of people's opinions. And of course, John Gottman, I think, was one of the first people. He was probably the first big popularizer of the idea of the science behind relationships. But the field has just, been advancing by leaps and bounds. And so coming out of, my graduate work, like the biggest thing I think I realized was I want to take all this relationship science and make it accessible. So every couple weeks, I just produce a new article, and it just starts with some kind of, vignette or a hook to engage folks. And then it explains like a single piece of relationship science. And then it ends with how you can apply this in your relationship. And so I hope it's just a fun, engaging way for people to get more curious about the processes that are happening in their relationship. I think we focus so much on individual mental health now in our society, which is, I think, overall a really good step forward. But I think one big drawback of that is we lose sight that, as humans, we are, truly, we are hypersocial creatures. We rely on this web of connections to other people to really thrive. There's almost no one who thrives who's not connected to others. And so I think this is, hopefully a chance for people to take that same kind of interest in psychology and mental health and well-being, but to get more curious about the relationships, which ultimately are probably more of like a positive sum for the individual and society as a whole.
Well, and those sound like invitations to slow down, right? They sound like great lead-ins to different awareness points that might be useful for folks. Love
Yep,
that.
absolutely.
That's cool. I think so. And then, right, the sum total of everything that you've talked about today, I think filters into your latest project, the Happy Couple Project, and your current landscape in Mountain One, again, as you're now rebuilding, right? Building something entirely new. So tell us about the Happy Couple Project and what this means for you.
I'm so excited about this. It's just launched. It basically feels, I suppose, like a lot of things. It's like, what did I not have? What did I want that wasn't available? And it was really a space for me and Anna to work on our relationship in a context that was more like when we first met as a couple. Because one of the things I noticed when I started engaging a lot in the relationship space is I started telling people, hey, I've gotten certified in Gottman method and I've got a workshop. A few people were excited, which was great, but the majority of people were like, work? I work all the time. I work
Meal.
on being a good parent. I work at my job. I work on being a good, whatever, child to my parents, neighbor, community member, you name it. And so the whole idea of this is we've got experiential date nights where there, of course, will be a little bit of relationship science and a little twist to the activity, but it'll just be a fun play-based activity. So we've been doing things like pickleball, and we have a cocktail making class and a flower arranging class. And so it's a chance for couples to take something that they honestly often skimp on, which is date night, and make it a really fun, joyful, and uplifting space, but also to hopefully just, shine a tiny light of awareness on what are the processes happening in their relationship and what might their role be in them and how might it be a little bit different. And then we also do, as I said, since workshops, didn't seem to resonate, we do what we call fun shops, where it's people who actually want to go a little bit deeper. And then we're also doing retreats and coaching programs starting in 2026.
That's awesome. I love that. Fun shops. Noted.
Fun shops.
What it
Yep.
what it is. Because hard work can be fun, right? And the
Sure can.
yeah,
Sure can.
yeah. Okay. Thanks for coming on and doing the interview today. Super appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I love sitting in a different chair.
Yeah. So, are you ready for some blind rapid fire questions?
I sure am. Yeah, I'm curious what you got up your sleeve.
So, first one, what are 2 items on your bucket list?
Mm, 2 items on my bucket list. Okay. So one is just I've got a 5-year-old, and I want my son to actually want to hang out with me when he's in his 20s. I don't take that for granted. But I don't have a lot of control over that. I think another thing that I would really love to do is I would love to learn how to do outdoor rock climbing. I did a teeny bit of it in college, but it just looks I'm a little bit afraid of heights. Used to be a lot afraid of heights. And so it looks kind of terrifying, but just, being out there in nature, looking like Spider-Man on one of those rocks, that'd be pretty awesome.
Love that. Okay. A place that you are gonna be traveling in the next 5 years that you're most excited to go?
Well, I have a trip planned to Dublin next year. And I briefly went to Dublin, I think, when I was in my early 20s, but it was a trip to visit my sister because she was in, God, now I'm trying to remember. No, actually, I didn't even make it to Dublin, did I? I don't think I made it there. Yeah, my sister studied in Scotland, and we went to, I think, Northwest Ireland, but we didn't go to, or maybe we spent a day. So anyway, this is not very like rapid fire. Dublin. I got a lot of Irish heritage. I'm just excited to see what's over there.
I love that. If you could only eat one food for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Can I say smoothie? That's kind of cheating, huh?
I think that's fair though.
Okay,
What
all
kind
right.
of smoothie?
My favorite smoothie is gonna be, it's got some kale, some ginger, some green apples, banana, goji berries.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably my go-to.
Love that. Love
I could live on that.
Awesome. All right, let's do our final take. Is there anything you didn't get to or anything that you'd especially like to reiterate for the audience today?
This is one of my favorite sort of personal like mindset shifts I like to do, is whenever I start feeling really resentful or something I'm kind of ashamed of, like, God, that person's really like, that person's a jerk. That person sucks, or I feel lonely, or I feel rejected because this board didn't ask me to continue. I like to just flip that around, and instead of saying like I shouldn't feel rejected or I shouldn't feel lonely, just flip it around and say I should feel lonely because this is hard. And so I think just, being willing to validate, there's research, a lot of research behind this that, particularly the transition to parenthood for most couples, but there's just these periods when we look at a relationship together over decades, there are going to be really hard periods. That's life. And so being okay acknowledging that and acknowledging your own pain and your own struggles, and then using that as kind of like a foundation for what do you want to build towards? Because I just think sometimes some of the relationship stuff out there is like, do these 3 techniques and do this and do that, and then you're just going to have this kind of like idyllic life where everything is amazing. And I think that is dead wrong, and I think it's actually missing. This is, one of my favorite quips that I heard from a friend, which is that, everything meaningful in my life has been associated with pain and suffering. Not exclusively, but I mean, the things that I most value in my life, I've had to really fight for. And so this just may be one of those periods where we really have to fight for our relationship, and to do so in a really wise way that we're going to feel good about, looking back 10 years from now.
I love that. I think just on mountain one, right? Giving yourself permission to be human, and that reminder that you put earlier that we were designed to do hard things and that both are true. Thanks, Cam.
Thanks for having me.